Hi, welcome to School and Society Week 2. We're going to be talking more about what we want schools to do and what are the various problems of school reform over the course of history. So our guiding question for this week is, what do we want schools to do? And you could put the emphasis on different parts of that question. What do we want schools to do? Or I don't know, whatever. Anyways, there are definitely different ways to think about this question. And the other way to think about this question is, what do you want schools to do for you and your family, or you and yourself personally? And what do you want schools to do for the people around you? And those two questions might not necessarily be the same thing, or they might be. We're talking about this question using two texts. The first is Joel Spring, Chapter 1, and David Labaree's piece, Private Good, Public Good, which is about the struggle over educational goals. David Labaree is a sociologically oriented historian of education. So he likes to think about different structures and people and how social change happens over time. And he uses history as a way of tracing claims. And he makes this claim about there being 3 different ways of understanding schooling. And I'm going to unpack that for you. And you can also have your text in front of you and try to underline it while I'm talking. So this is, of course, his text, and I want to show you a little bit about sort of, where this comes from. So his title is Public Goods, Private Goods, the Struggle Over Educational Goals, the American Struggle Over Educational Goals. And it's in the American Educational Research Journal. And if you wanted to look that up, you would be able to tell that that's a prestigious journal that comes out of the American Educational Research Association. So it's peer reviewed, which means that multiple people had to review what he wrote before it was finally published. And this was published in 1997. So it's a little dated, but it's more of a philosophical historical text. So if we think about it that way and think about it as something that maybe doesn't explain everything that's happening today, but helps us understand certain phenomenon, we can take what we want and leave the rest. Now, I want to talk about 2 terms that are really central to what David Labaree is talking about, and they don't mean what we think they mean. So liberal and democracy. Liberal, we're not talking about liberals and conservatives. We're talking about liberal as part of a market. So thinking about how in liberalism, right, in a market-based system, individuals are free to do, buy, and be, and what and how they want. And the market is governed by supply and demand. It is, because of that, highly unequal, and people retain the sense of being highly individualistic. And then for democracy more or less means what we think it means. So it's the rule with the consent of the citizens, so voting, relative political equality. We have a constitution to which we're all held accountable in theory, right? And we are all equal under democracy. 1 person equals 1 vote. And you can kind of see how there's a tension between these 2 things. So one refers to our economic system and one refers to our political system. And this is the core of what David Labaree is talking about. So he's really talking about how we like to complain. We want to reform schools, but we can't actually agree on what we want to do to change them. And this should sound familiar. If we all went around the room and brainstormed the things that are wrong, that we think are wrong, we probably wouldn't agree on what the problems were, and we definitely wouldn't agree on what we needed to do to fix them. So that makes things tough. We can't even really probably decide on whether we need a pedagogical, so that's related to teaching, organizational, like districts, or social or cultural reform to fix what is wrong with schools. David Labaree believes that the main problem with schools is political. And that's because we don't even know what we want and we can't even agree. Again, I'm going to put this question to you. What kind of schools do we want? Do we want schools to keep society the same, or do we want them to change society? David Labaree thinks that the essential problem with our political disagreement over schools comes from the tension between the 2 things I just talked about, the market and the political system that we believe in. So he says the essential problem posed by that tension is this: unfettered economic freedom leads to a highly unequal distribution of wealth and power, which in turn undercuts the possibility for democratic control. But at the same time, restricting such economic freedom in the name of equality infringes on individual liberty, without which democracy can turn into the dictatorship of the majority. And at the heart of this are two questions. Do we choose democracy and the equality it promises, or do we choose economic freedom and the inequality it implies? And these are the two tensions that are really central, or the one central tension that is central to what we want schools to do. David Labaree says that there have been these three goals that schools generally have. And you can underline this in the text. He provides really detailed examples that are historical, but I'm just going to go through and give you some bullet points about it. He also thinks that these three goals shift between seeing education as a private good or education as a public good, which I'll disentangle in a second. So for the first one, democratic equality, it's always had rhetorical significance, right? You're probably not going to ever hear from a politician that schools shouldn't be trying to serve the interests of democracy, right? Explicitly, at least. Schools are important places where we become citizens. The purpose of schooling under a democratic equality ideal is to create good citizens. We want to create good people. We want to create equality among people. And this has had varying degrees of importance. So at the beginning of the Republic, it was really important because the founding fathers had decided on democracy, which was different from monarchy. And in democracy, each person has to take part in political governance. So it's important that people aren't stupid, right? And that they feel a sense of connection to other people. Social efficiency is Labaree's second goal. It's all about adapting people to fit into society, in particular, to be able to work and be productive members of the economy. So in this scenario, the purpose of schooling is to get a job and to become a good worker, right? And to fill a social need. In this scenario, education is sort of like a sorting mechanism. It sorts people into different kinds of categories. It sorts people into different kinds of jobs, which, as we know, mean different kinds of lives. And here's where we get into the idea of credentials or degrees or whatever you want to call it. Getting a job, it's a competitive thing. And one thing that helps you get a job is a degree. And in order for a degree, like a bachelor's or a master's or a PhD, to be meaningful is if you have something that other people don't. So instead of just a high school degree, you suddenly need a college degree. And then once everyone has a college degree, suddenly you need a master's degree. And here's the problem. As a democratically minded person, I totally want to live in a world where everyone is educated. But as a person moving within our economy, I want to have a job because I have bills, and so I want for myself to have an advantage over others because of the nature of the economic system. Which brings us into Labaree's third goal of education, social mobility. In this scenario, education is something that benefits me as an individual. It's a private good because I want it for myself and to distinguish myself to gain social and economic advantage. So maybe I will distinguish myself through the degrees that I have. Or if suddenly everyone has a master's degree, it might become more important where I went to school or what program I studied in. And so among these three ideas about the goal of public education, there's the shifting about whether it's public or private. So if something is public, it's available to all for no cost. And my having it doesn't actually diminish someone else's having it. So according to democratic equality, education is a public good, something that benefits everyone and should be freely available to everyone, for example. If education is a private good, it must be bought to be consumed. It has to be scarce. It pertains just to me and to me alone. And it's something that I hold as part of what I can exchange for the ability to be a competitive person in the market that we live in. And that would be more in line with the social mobility understanding of education, if that makes sense. So thinking broadly about whether education is a public good, as in something that we want everyone to have, or if education is a private good, as in something that we want some people to have or for us to have and others to not have so that we can get it ahead in life, I want to think about the purpose of education. So is the purpose of education, the purpose of schooling to create citizens? Is it to create workers? Can school help us get ahead? Should it? If we are using school to advance socially and economically, what does that mean for the people around us? Do we not want that for them? I want to watch a video, which is called The Case Against School. And I don't bring it up here because I'm endorsing the ideas, but I want to put it here because I think it's provocative and thought-provoking. And I think it helps us think through some of Labaree's points and indirectly maybe consider a few parts of Spring Chapter 1, where he talks about the history of education. So to introduce this video, I want to talk a little bit about this image that I'm showing you. The first image is from the 70s, and it's been popularized by Mike Rowe, who says he saw it in his guidance counselor's office. If we look at it, it's trying to sell reluctant teenagers on the idea of college. It's juxtaposing certain sorts of labor and different sorts of positions in society. It's making some oblique moral judgments about different kinds of work. We have in many ways absorbed the idea of this hierarchy, as in it's better to be smart or to work smart and to not work hard, or we pervert it and say work smarter, not harder. But in this scenario, clearly they're juxtaposing a college educated or high school educated person with a person who is doing and performing manual labor. So thinking through this, I want to actually watch this video and think about what we want education to do.
It's absolutely true that school makes people show up, sit down, shut up, and that these are useful skills for people to have in adulthood. So the real question is, if all we're trying to do is prepare people for a job, why not prepare them with a job?
I'm Nick Gillespie for Reason, and today we are talking with the author of what is almost certainly going to be the most controversial book of the year. Bryan Caplan is an economics professor at George Mason University, and his new book is The Case Against Education. Bryan, thanks for talking with Reason.
Thanks for such an exciting introduction.
Well, let's get right to it. Early on, you say flatly, you write flatly, this book argues that our education system is a big waste of time and money. And now you're not simply saying that our schools are overpriced and uneven in quality. You are actually making the case that much of our traditional education system, especially higher ed, is literally a waste of time, right?
Absolutely.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that people are going there to get a higher income, but they're actually not getting much in the way of job skills, which raises a big puzzle for an economist. How can they be getting a higher income if they're not getting much in the way of job skills? And my answer comes down to something called the signaling model of education that says that a lot of the reason why education pays isn't that you learn useful skills, but that you distinguish yourself, that you're getting stamped or labeled, you're getting a sticker on your forehead, grade A worker.
So it's kind of like you come out as a piece of steak, you're USDA prime, but you haven't been cooked yet. So
right,
you haven't
precisely. And the key thing about this is, selfishly speaking, it doesn't really matter why you're getting more money. But from a social point of view, from the point of view of is this a good use of taxpayer dollars, it matters tremendously, because if everybody just gets more years in education and all you're doing is showing off, then you're just raising the bar for how much school you need in order to get a job in the first place.
So let's talk about the magnitude of wasted time and money. I guess for most people, if you go from kindergarten through a BA, you're talking about 17 years roughly. Yep. So that's a lot of time. But how much money do we spend as a society on education?
Yeah, so government funding is about $1 trillion a year when you add up all levels.
Our economy is about $20 trillion.
Yeah.
So that's a large chunk of change.
So you're talking about something like 5% of all GDP. And then, of course, private spending tops it up a bit further. So, it's something over $1 trillion.
And by the way, one thing that's interesting about this is you don't really make a distinction between private and public education, because this isn't a book about like how the public school system is failing kids. It's just how education is useless.
I mean, I know libertarians want to hear a different story, but I'm telling the story that I think is true rather than the story that that I would even find ideologically most congenial. The main thing is I've gone to public school, I've gone to private school. I don't really see very much difference, and in both cases, it seems to me that most of what's going on is showing off in order to look better for the labor market, which again individually makes perfect sense, but socially speaking, everyone can't be above average.
So this is kind of like a private vice is actually becomes a public vice or rather a private virtue becomes a public vice because.
Yeah, I think of this as education as being a lot like football stadiums, where like the main libertarian complaint about football stadiums isn't that we're not making the right kind of football stadiums; it's that government is pouring a ton of money on something, and really what we need is to have fewer and worse football stadiums.
Right, but more money left for people to spend in a meaningful way.
Yeah, but and possibly not on football stadiums, possibly on totally different things.
Before we go into the signaling model per se, talk a little bit about the human capital model of education, because these are the two big competing explanations. What is the human capital education model?
Yeah, the human capital model is a fancy phrase for what your teachers and politicians and your parents have been telling you, which is you go to school to get smart and to learn all kinds of useful stuff, which you're then going to apply in the real world.
You're investing in yourself.
Yeah, you're investing in yourself. So you're transforming unskilled labor into a skilled, talented adult, most associated with Gary Becker, the famous Nobel Prize winning economist. But really, he was just putting an academic veneer on something that is widely propagandized in favor of, again, the idea of school as a skills factory.
It's not simply, very few people, and you point this out continuously in the book, and I think accurately, nobody, if you go to take a shop class, you're not going to go and learn how to cut ninja stars out of sheets of metal, and that's the job you're going to have in a factory. But the idea is that you learn skills, that you learn how to show up on time, you learn how to listen and follow instructions, you learn how to self-learn, and you're saying that this is actually not a very, how do you know that that's not an accurate model?
That's one of the best arguments in favor of the education we have. It's one, by the way, that people usually have to be forced into after a series of intellectual retreats. But here's the main thing that I say about that. It's absolutely true that school makes people show up, sit down, shut up, and that these are useful skills for people to have in adulthood. So the real question is, if all we're trying to do is prepare people for a job, why not prepare them with a job instead of with school, where the overlap, there is a partial overlap in skills, but there's, of course, there's a lot of stuff that you're taught in school that is dysfunctional in the real world, like it's very important for everything to be fair. Jobs aren't fair, but school, everything has to be fair.
Talk about the sheepskin effect, because for me, this is the thing that totally, whatever affection I had for the human capital model of education, this really kind of kicked that to the curb.
So diplomas used to be written on the skins of sheep, and the sheepskin effect refers to the fact that a lot of the payoff from education comes from crossing the finish line, from graduation, a disproportionate amount. So, in the book, I just average over a whole lot of studies. So for college, finishing senior year pays something like 7 times as much as a regular year. 7 times as much. Now, either we save almost all the useful job skills for graduation year, which sounds really implausible. Senior year is goof-off year, not finally learn some job skills year. Or there's something going on in the rewards for education that's not about skills that you're learning. And I say, like the main thing that we're getting is it's a signal of conformity. In our society, we're expected to graduate. Everyone tells you to graduate. If you fail to do so despite all of this social pressure, you're saying something very bad about yourself, and the labor market responds negatively to you.
Although one of the things that is, I think, really interesting about the book is that you do steer clear of extremes, because there are, immediately you can hear people saying, well, what about Steve Jobs? What about Bill Gates? What about Michael Dell? There's the list of, or Andrew Carnegie for that matter, So, you're not saying that all of these things are, infinite, extremely, perfectly right.
Yeah, of course. So, I have 2 chapters in the book that are the most quantitative part, where I sit around trying to crunch the numbers and say what fraction of the payoff for education comes from human capital, what fraction comes from signaling. Of course, you learn reading and writing and math in school to some degree, and of course, those are useful job skills. But what fraction of the time that you're in school is really learning anything you're ever going to use again? What fraction of the payoff comes from what you've learned rather than what you've demonstrated you can do?
What do you do with the arguments that, well, school, maybe, or education, and particularly K through 12, education is not for job skills, but it's for citizenship. And this is not, the progressive era talked a lot about that. Like, we need to make good citizens, especially out of increased numbers of immigrants who had no understanding of American history. Where does that fall in the human capital model?
Right. So, that would actually be totally outside of it. Again, human capital versus signaling are trying to figure out, why do employers pay you more for it? Now, this other stuff, I have a full chapter on it as well. And, it just begins with saying, look, the argument in principle is sound, but we have to look empirically to see whether it's really true. I have a big section where I just go over how much civics do American adults even know? And the answer is next to nothing. Next to nothing.
Yeah, you note that if people who were born here or are citizens have to pass the citizenship test of immigrants, but I think it was something like 70% fail.
I'm glad you remember that. I don't. But what we can see is that, like, even the most basic stuff, like how many senators each state have, maybe half of American adults know this. This is not after like a 1 week course in civics. So so American high school students on average will do 3 years of civics and history. So 3 years, and yet what do we have to show for it? Next to nothing.
Well, we have football stadiums.
Yes, we have football stadiums.
So talk about the signaling model.
Yes.
How does the signaling model work? You say, partly it shows that you're willing to conform to certain basic norms that are going to make you appealing to employers, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different desirable traits that you are signaling with educational accomplishments. So there's the obvious ones. You're signaling they're smart. Smart people do better in school. If you've done well in school, natural inference is the person's probably smart. Not necessarily, but generally. You're signaling work ethic, because even the smartest person in the world can't do well in school if they don't show up and do a bit of work. And then finally, the most subtle one that I talk about a lot is conformity, signaling you're willing to submit to social norms. And that's the conformity one is where we really get things like the sheepskin effect. Because if we're just signaling intelligence and work ethic, then there still isn't really a good story. Well, why does the last year pay so much? Once you accept that a lot of it is about, yes, master, I will conform to what our society demands of me. That's where graduation is so important. That's why in a country where college lasts 3 years, it's the third year that's crucial.
Right.
Country where it lasts 4 years, it's the fourth year that's crucial. Just like in a country where suits are the standard thing you wear in an interview, you better wear a suit or else you look like a weirdo and people don't want to hire you.
Libertarianism is about individualism, but then is there a sliding scale of like when you get too conformist, because then you're also not a good worker, right? In many ways, like you're an economics professor. If you were simply doing what everybody else was doing, that would be a problem.
A line that I quote in the book roughly is what employers want is intelligent conformism. They want people who apply their full intellectual power to the task that is given to them. Now, sometimes there are creative occupations where they're told, be creative on this task.
Right.
But even there, almost no employer wants you to be so creative that you say, hey, maybe this project isn't worth doing. Maybe I should be the boss. So there's always that. And then again, of course, most jobs are not really very creative. And there's a tendency in the information age to focus on the small share of jobs where we do want people shooting basketball where they shoot the breeze.
Right.
But even most jobs are not like that. Vast majority of jobs are not like that. It's about there's a customer, he wants a definite product, give him that product, or else I don't want you around.
Talk about one of the ways that this system gets enforced is through, you talk about social desirability bias.
Yes.
What is that, and how does that inform the larger education network?
Right. So, social desirability bias is the concept in psychology that is barely known by either economists or libertarians, and yet should be the single most cited concept in psychology. Social desirability bias. Simple version is people like to say what sounds good. They like to say things that will make people think that they are a kind, respectful, and respectable person. Right? So you can see this in things like, what is the socially desirable answer to am I fat? Of course, the socially desirable answer is I'm not fat. Now, of course, some people aren't fat, and then you just tell them the truth. But on the other hand, we know that if someone is in fact fat, our strong temptation is to say something that sounds good but isn't true. This is something where, of course, we see it in daily life, but also has clear political roles. Just think about any time a politician says, and we need to put more resources into education, healthcare, and the environment. Right? Now, these are all things that sound good. If you could imagine a politician saying, we have now done enough for education and healthcare and the environment. They're important, but enough is enough. Right. That's nothing that a politician would ever want to stick their neck out and say, because it sounds bad. It sounds like you're not a caring person. You're not a respectable person. When I say this, I think a lot of the support for education is social desirability bias. It's the sense that the only thing that a good person would say is more and better, never less and worse.
There are obviously entrenched interests in the kind of education industry, as well as it helps employers, right? Because employers, even if we're not learning the skills, they're going to train us on the job for whatever we need to do, but they benefit in a way, right, from the signaling process, because it makes it. You at one point you said that. Employers can't look at every individual applicant closely, so they use these as rough sorts.
Yeah, employers benefit from there being some signal, but I don't think employers benefit from the college degree being the signal of quality rather than the high school degree. This is something where, like in 1950, it would something like 25% of American adults would have finished high school at that point. And then a employer could say, well, a high school graduate, great, perfect, for managerial material. Now it's a college degree. As to why employers benefit from pulling 4 years worth of labor off the job market, I don't think that they do, actually.
Well, can we talk about that? What is what is the historical, the kind of material basis for this? Again, schools became, at least up through 6th grade or 8th grade for most kids, started to become mandatory in the early 19th century. By the end of the century, it was everywhere. Is part of the growth of education as being so important and central to our identity? Is it simply we need to warehouse kids now that we don't need them to be chimney sweeps or to, do like things, kids have little hands. They can work on machines with little hands, things like that, or hawk newspapers. We don't need them to do that labor anymore. Are we just warehousing kids? Like, what's the sociology of why, or the genealogy of why we have so much education?
Going back 100 years, there is this popular story that employers wanted kids trained to be cogs in the corporate machine. I would say, if you really wanted to train cogs in your corporate machine, you would not design anything like the public school system. It would be like military school. You would whip kids into shape, get them to say yes, sir, give them a lot of propaganda about how great their corporate paymasters are. That's not the way that education looked 100 years ago, and it's certainly not the way that it looks today. This is not a system that really seems to be designed to prepare prepare work people to be useful employees. You never have the everyone's a beautiful, unique snowflake kind of propaganda, the touchy-feeliness. That's not what employers want. Employers want someone that will follow orders, do what they're told, and accept criticism, which is, of course, crucial for learning. So I don't think that it really makes much sense to think of the current system as something that has been molded for the interests of corporate America. I think so. Corporate America, of course, they can tweak it a little bit in their favorite direction.
But what else would we do with kids?
Yeah. So there's kids and kids, right? Young kids, of course, they need to be warehoused, right? So give them daycare. Well, even there, as to why kids can't go to school and then learn reading, writing, and math for a few hours and then get to play for the rest of the day within a supervised facility. We've got no clue about why you couldn't just do that rather than boring them to death and making them study stuff they don't care about. But again, for older kids, for 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, as to why they can't actually be out of the real world as apprentices, there are countries that do this. Germany and Switzerland do this. No reason why American kids could not do this as well. Right? And, say they can't do anything. Sure, they can do stuff. Say, well, we don't need them. Well, again, the economy is not based upon what we need. It's based upon what we got. Right? They're what do we need? We need a few bowls of rice a day. But what we've got, however, is enough to go and produce vastly more. I don't see any reason why teenagers could not be part of the labor market at a much earlier age than they are right now.
So in thinking about that video, there's also a response that came out about the case against education. And essentially, you can read it for yourself if you'd like, but one of the points of the original video is that English, history, social sciences, liberal arts are sort of useless because they don't lead to employment. And I mean, spoiler alert, that's not something that I believe, because I enjoy reading for reading's sake and thinking about ideas. And I think that education has intrinsic value, even if it doesn't lead to something concrete. But that's an interesting kind of thing to think of. And so the case against education talks a lot about basically the most obvious response to his assertions is that in a democracy, liberal education provides knowledge, skills, and values needed by all of us to make success of our experiment in self-government. So again, taking this democratic equality approach to education. So I'm just going to leave you with these ideas. I want you to think about them. I want you to do the reading in light of this debate. And I want you to think about, what do we want education to do? Do we want education to give people skills? Do we want it to give people the capacity to think? Is it about socialization? Is it about job training? Is it about social advantage? Is it about creating an equal society? And I just want you to sit with those questions, think about them, and then on Wednesday we'll talk. And then on between Wednesday and Friday, you'll meet with your small group and think through some of these together. Thank you.